Players gather to cast powerful spells, some of the oldest and most powerful in the history of Magic the Gathering. Brainstorm, Ponder, Preordain, and many others, battling head-to-head in brutal combat. They all have one thing in common: to uphold their legacy and search for eternal glory.
The Eternal Glory podcast is brought to you by BoshNRoll on YouTube, ThrabenU University, and theepicstorm.com. This episode is sponsored by Tales of Adventure. Get sweet legacy staples and much more at toamagic.com.
Hello, and welcome to episode 82 of the Eternal Glory podcast, the old Sideboard Juke. We've already recorded 30 minutes of introduction and banter for the week, available in our Patreon exclusive pre-show. Check out patreon.com/eternalglory to gain access. As always, I'm Phil Gallagher, aka ThrabenU, joined by...
I am Brian Coval, aka BoshNRoll.
And I am Bryant Cook of the Epic Storm.
All right, you want to know how we're doing in our lives? That's what the pre-show is for. We're going to jump right into the theory tonight.
Hold up, let me thank our new Patreon. We got Connor McElhinney in the Patreon now, who is our newest member to hear. Our pre-show got a little deep, maybe even bordering on like a little aggressive this time. There were some hot takes from at least two of our three co-hosts here, and real thoughts of what we really think about some certain things in the certain decks and certain things that are going on in the world. It's a good one.
It's a good time.
Get in there.
All right, so this episode is actually inspired by a specific deck list. So recently we saw a Doomsday list doing extremely well in Legacy, which had Sheoldred the Apocalypse. That is the new 4-mana black Sheoldred card that deals damage to people for drawing cards.
Whoa, that's not true. Why don't we read what the card does, Phil?
Fine, we can read the full text of the card.
Dealing damage and loss of life are not the same thing, and I would like to just, really make that point known as the person that plays cards that cause people to lose life. Not the same.
All right, fine. Full text. Sheoldred the Apocalypse, 2 colorless, 2 black, 4/5. Legendary creature, Phyrexian Praetor with Death Touch. Whenever you draw a card, you gain 2 life. Whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. And flavor text, of course, is Gix failed. I shall not.
I thought the flavor text was Death Touch.
That's other flavor text. I love that your Sheoldred voice is deeper than your normal deep man voice. And Sheoldred is, I guess I don't really know how gender and sexuality fluctuate among Phyrexians because they're mostly robots, but female presenting Praetor. I don't know.
All right, look, I don't know exactly what a Phyrexian Dreadnought sounds like. And I don't know how those two voices merge, but I don't know. It felt right.
All right, fair enough. Praetors can sound like whatever you want in your dreams until Magic the Gathering gives us the TV show we need. Come on, Netflix, pick it up. Let us hear Sheoldred's real voice.
I would like to hear Phil's falsetto, just real high. I think that would be nice. Phil, can you read it again?
Wait. What if Sheoldred is like a Southern grandma? I do declare you lose 2 life. I think that's what she sounds like. Like picture her in like a hat that they wear at the Kentucky Derby. I'm in. Yeah, that's better than Phil's thing. Let's move on. Anyway, we're talking about how Max Dorshin won the Legacy Showcase. No small feat. That is the best players on Magic Online doing their best. And Max went in with Turbo Doomsday. And just, this isn't the only thing we're talking about. We're using it as a setting point for our conversation. But basically, Max's build played 4 personal tutors and 2 Cabal rituals on top of the 4 dark rituals, where the bet was, I'm going to go faster than everyone game 1. And then if they can hang game 2, I'm just going to be a Sheoldred deck. And your dark rituals, your Cabal rituals, your Lotus Petals get Sheoldred out faster. And your same Thoughtseizes, Duresses, and Force of Wills that protect your Doomsday game 1, protect your Sheoldred game 2. Doomsday specifically is a deck that removal doesn't do anything against. Like even the Epic Storm or Show and Tell or Reanimator, like maybe you keep your Prismatic Endings in, or your 1 or 2 Swords to Plowshares in case like a Grizzlebrand or Archon sneaks through your defenses. Doomsday has nothing to target with removal. And especially like the blue-black turbo version. If you see white mana, maybe you respect Monastery Mentor game 2. Like that's a juke we know about already, but straight up blue-black turbo and a tight little package of the Bug Mother Sheoldred, you're not leaving in plows for that. And the card is not really beatable if you can't remove it. Really smart decision there, and that is what we're talking about.
I think it's interesting when you look at how Doomsday's evolved over the last 6 to 8 months, where part of addressing the Delver issue for that deck was members of the community decided that, hey, basic lands are good. Maybe we shouldn't just be playing 5 copies of Underground Sea. Let's cut the Watery Grave. Let's add in one of each basic. And if we're going to do that, maybe we should run a couple copies of Cabal Ritual. And then Sheoldred gave them an additional payoff other than Doomsday that really allowed them to abuse that extra mana. So it just makes sense that something that fits so nicely into the game plan worked, right?
Yeah, and the thing about Sheoldred that I didn't really think about at first, but I listened, Everyday Eternal, our buddies over there on the Everyday Eternal podcast, had Max on, and they really dug into his tournament. And as a control deck, I frequently do something like leave 1 Swords to Plowshares in the deck just in case my opponent has a juke. I can dig for it. You can't dig with Sheoldred in play. Ponder into Brainstorm into another Ponder trying to find my 1 Swords to Plowshares. I just took 12 on my turn. Like draw for turn, cast Ponder, cast Brainstorm, cast Ponder again. I'm dead. It's like the perfect juke because it stops control decks from also looking for their one out if they even left one in.
So this is also so much of a swing in life total in a single cycle. So assuming no spells are played, your opponent loses 2 when they draw the card on their turn. You gain 2 when you draw the card on your turn, and then you attack for 4. So assuming nothing else has happened in one turn cycle, this impacts cumulative life totals by 8 points, and that scales up with every cantrip that happens.
Yeah, another thing that was said on Everyday Eternal was compare Sheoldred plus Brainstorm to Murktide Regent. If you have Sheoldred, you draw for turn, +2. You cast Brainstorm, plus another 6. That's 8. You've fogged a maximum size Murktide Regent, and if your opponent ever casts a Brainstorm, they draw for turn, lose 2, cast Brainstorm, lose another 6. They've taken a hit from a full-size Murktide Regent. That's so messed up when you just compare it to this card that many people want banned, and Sheoldred is like just generating that out of normal cards while also being a 4/5 body in play.
Yeah, Sheoldred trades very well with most things in the format. There's very few things that just casually have 5 power. Like 3 is super common with like Delvers, Dragon Rage Channelers, Elvish Reclaimers, that sort of stuff. It's hard for something to get to 5 power, and since Sheoldred has Death Touch, you can trade with both creatures that your opponent throws in front of the giant black bus. And if you have something like a Sudden Edict, combat's scary.
Right. So I feel this devolving into a Sheoldred love letter, which it's not. We are talking about sideboard jukes. Let's get back to that. Sheoldred makes a lot of sense in a deck like Doomsday, where your opponent cannot board out their removal fast enough. I've died to Doomsday many times with just Swords to Plowshares, Prismatic Ending in my hand, and can't even wait to turn those into literally anything. I'll board in something like, I don't know, like some even unplayable card in the matchup. I would board in like Energy Flux just to pitch it to force over keeping a Prismatic Ending in my deck against Doomsday in the past. That is the perfect spot to walk through that gap.
All right, so let's kind of start from the very beginning. When we say like a sideboard juke, what sort of thing are we referring to? Because Sheoldred obviously is one, but like definitionally, like what are we talking about?
We started this conversation off air because Bryant said something and I was like, wait, is that a juke? And then we were like, pause, save this for the air. I consider a juke when your plan is different after sideboard. Like your opponent is expecting you to do one thing and you do something different. And I consider it to be like at the fundamental level where like your Doomsday deck now has Sheoldred, or your Doomsday deck now has Monastery Mentor, or your Sneak and Show deck has Jace the Mind Sculptor, or something like that. That's kind of what I'm picturing. But then Bryant said something interesting about considering Xantid Swarm a juke out of combo decks, where I think that's like a sideboard level system where like maybe it is a juke because we don't really expect you to have creatures, but then you do. But that creature is used to the end of storming out. So, Brian, what do you think?
Well, I reference Xanadu as a traditional juke because historically what happens is control decks go, hey, Swords to Plowshares is bad against Storm. Why don't we board out Swords? And then you bring in Xanadu, they're left without removal. It dodges Force and Negation, you attack, and then you get to do your thing. It's more of a sidestep than a full juke. I would agree that a juke, in my mind, usually changes the deck at a fundamental level. So, for example, I played Lotus Breach last week on the Epic Storm YouTube channel where I boarded into Death Shadow. I've already been playing Thoughtseize and Street Wraith in the deck. A listener was like, why don't you try out Shadow on the board? That's a juke because it's entirely different, doesn't use the graveyard, entirely different game plan. But I guess I'll just talk about it now if it's okay with the two of you. Your juke needs to be different enough that the removal spells being boarded out or cards being boarded out don't impact the juke at all, which is why Sheoldred works. You just can't have, if your main plan loses the lightning bolt, don't board in a plan that loses the lightning bolt, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely. I guess like sidestep to juke on the spectrum, we could call it like a mini juke, or maybe a juke is a big sidestep. I don't know. I think we're in the same ballpark here. It was just interesting to me that Xanted Swarm was in your juke conversation at all, but I think I agree with it now that it's been said out loud. So mini jukes versus fundamental plan changes, also aka transformational sideboards. I guess that's the extreme end of a juke, where now your deck is just different, where I guess we can keep referencing Doomsday because they've been doing a lot of cool stuff trying to fix the Delver matchup for the last couple of years. And the versions that don't even have Doomsday in the deck at all, the Esper ones that they kind of like have Baleful Strix in the main deck anyway. It's just like a way to buy time and set up their Doomsday. And then they board in just 3 or 4 Monastery Mentors and they already play Cavern in game 1 to get their Oracle through. And now you can Cavern on Human and get your Monk to resolve and also cast like Snapcaster Mage or whatever, and you're just a tempo mentor deck. I would consider that a transformational sideboard, which is the extreme end of the juke spectrum. And normally transformational sideboards are only used in extreme cases. Like generally just having a sideboard and executing on a plan is better and making small adjustments. But if there's actually a giant problem, a well-represented deck that you're not going to beat without a transformation, that's usually where you want to go that deep.
So, for example, some of the, at this point, real old versions of decks like Oops All Spells would be an entirely graveyard-focused deck in Game 1, and then transform into a Goblin Charbelcher deck for the post-sideboard games because all the rituals and fast mana worked out the same way. That's not usually true anymore because, like, the cards they can play, like Force of Vigor, have just gotten so much better. There's not really as strong of a need to do that anymore. But that was an example of a somewhat common instance of a transformational sideboard.
As people who do donation decks, people love the full transformational sideboard, and I'm sure the two of you have received dozens and dozens of them. One thing that always strikes me odd is sometimes I think people love the idea so much they forget that they have to do something unique. I've definitely received Tinfin's variants that board into another graveyard thing. I'm like, oh, this isn't going to go well. So once again, I know that I sound like a broken record. Make sure that it's different.
Yeah, that's actually something I wanted to talk about. So I've played so many of these mono black decks, and not too long ago I played a mono black painter deck that was really good. But its sideboard juke was supposed to be Leyline and Helm of Obedience combo. But both of those things were vulnerable to artifact hate like Null Rod and Collector Oof. So I either had one or both of those combos in, and they were stopped by the same hate. So while those were different strategies and they did attack from slightly different angles, it wasn't actually a successful sideboard juke because the same sort of hate stopped both of them.
I've definitely never lost to a Collector Roof in my life.
Not even once. Couldn't be you.
Speaking of a successful version of that, I recently on camera got completely clowned. I was playing some sort of deck that used my graveyard a little bit, not like Reanimator, but something, maybe it was an Uro deck. That seems on brand for me. And my Storm opponent had a turn 0 Leyline against me. And I was like, oh, that's fine. That's kind of like I Ravenscribe them. I barely care about that. That's not really part of my plan anyway. and I just plodded forward with my control game. They went for like a storm attempt. I used my resources to stop it. And then when I had lethal on board, they like went for a YOLO brainstorm with 2 cards in their hand, and then went Dark Ritual, Helm of Obedience, blast you out of storm. I was not ready. I guess like if you're expecting Null Rod, that could walk into the same thing where like if I had a Null Rod, I would definitely bring it against Storm. But Flusterstorm, Pyroblast, Mindbreak Trap, any of that sort of thing. Deafening Silence, none of those things work against a Leyline Helm Juke out of Ad Nauseam Tendrils.
God, what? It was ad nauseum? Ad nauseum with probably 8.
I'm sure they took the Ad Nauseums out when they brought in their 4 mana spells, but yeah, it was like, it was not the Epic Storm. It was a very like Dark Ritual, Cabal Ritual centric Storm deck in game 1, and then game 3.
Was it Eggy Pop? I did upload Eggy Pop recently. I wonder if they were just bringing back the old original Storm deck.
Unclear. I feel like game 1 looked like very standard Ad Nauseam, and then game 2 also looked like standard Ad Nauseam, except they lost, and then game 3 looked real weird. And let me tell you, my opponent handled it beautifully in the chat, just spamming the worst BM imaginable, just like ha 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 ha, like all caps, like XD 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 XD, just like ding 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 ding, like filling up the chat box. I was like, okay, you earned that. I was pretty sure I could not lose that game from my position, and that's the point of the juke. Like, based on what I had in my hand, what I had on board, the hate I had available, whatever, I was not losing to a Storm line from the resources they had, but turns out they only needed 1 card in hand, and it was the Helm.
Why don't we break this down just a little bit further? So Brian, had you realized what they were up to, you could have prepared for this, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, to bring it back to current Legacy, Sheoldred popped up a lot this past weekend at the Legacy Pit Open. It's 1 week old technology. It's likely still to work. 3 weeks out, do you think Sheoldred out of Doomsday is going to be as effective when the rest of the metagame knows about it?
I think that in this specific case, the juke is so strong that it's likely to keep working, because it's not a transformational sideboard. You still have your Doomsday combo in the deck, even when you also have Sheoldred, where if you duress your opponent and see like Dress Down and Swords to Plowshares, like, okay, I'll take the Dress Down and Doomsday you. Nice Swords to Plowshares, dummy. Or just take the Swords to Plowshares. How many of those do you think they actually left in? Here's Sheoldred. And it just seems like a capable enough juke that people are not going to be like totally clowned by it, but I've been thinking about it since I saw the list as a resident control wizard. It's like, what am I going to do? Prioritize hands that have Caracas in them? Or like, what's the plan? Because leaving in 1 Swords to Plowshares in case they go for Sheoldred when they still have 5 duress effects and 4 to 8 force effects in their deck, and I can't cantrip for it once the thing resolves. I think I just have to like try to execute my game and beat Doomsday, and then hope I can wade through Sheoldred, like outmuscle it with an Uro or something. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm worried about it. It'll be worse. Like, it'll at least be on the radar, but I think if anything, it will incentivize questionable sideboarding and just increase variance in how the games can go. But yeah, I'm worried about that. Compared to something else like the Monastery Mentor juke out of the Esper Doomsday, like, I'm bringing in my Plague Engineers. I'm going ham on that one versus Monastery Mentor. Because they actually do cut their Doomsdays when they go for that plan. And then you're on a level game of, are they bringing in Mentors or are they staying Doomsday? Whereas the Sheoldred juke, they're still both.
I've been thinking a lot about it, and the Sheoldred juke is primarily there for, is it Delver or Blue-Red Delver, whatever you'd like to call it. A lot of those decks right now are running Unholy Heat. How big of a cost is it for a deck that plays Expressive Iteration, a card that does not draw cards but digs very, very well for Unholy Heat? If those players start to leave an Unholy Heat, how big is that as a cost? I know that Unholy Heat does nothing to the rest of the deck, so that's sort of a problem if you get glutted on Unholy Heats. That said, it's a 1-mana removal spell that you invested a lot of resources into casting Sheoldred. So that's just something I've been weighing back and forth is, will this plan work in 2 weeks once people start to leave an Unholy Heats?
Yeah, and then it's the flip side of, nice Unholy Heat in your hand. Doomsday you? Or how are you getting Delirium without drawing a bunch of cards? Like, you got to get an instant sorcery and artifact into your graveyard, unless Dragon's Rage Channeler is just milling them all there off of sorceries that don't actually draw cards, like Ponder, building Delirium, Brainstorm building Delirium, like, take 8, GG.
More generally, though, I do agree with Bryant's point. Jukes are often most effective when you are at the cutting edge of the technology, oftentimes because like you or your play group, the people that you're testing with, have designed the juke. So like the first time somebody goes like Dark Ritual Sheoldred on turn 2 out of Doomsday, the other person is just caught totally with their pants down. They have no idea it's coming. And as time goes on and you've seen this, you know the play pattern is coming, it becomes easier to address. Even though in this specific instance, I do think the juke is strong. I do think it will continue to work. But every time you create that sideboarding awkwardness for your opponent, especially with the less experienced players who might not actually like sit down and like write a sideboard guide before an event, they might not know how to deal with that at the time, and gives you a huge advantage.
I remember in the early days of my tracking my Epic Storm results, I averaged, this was still during like the Death Ray era, a pretty, below average win percentage for me at least. It was like 56, 58 win percentage. And AJ Kerrigan came to me with this quadruple Empty the Warrens, 4 probe, 4 Cabal therapy plan. And I was like, I don't know, AJ, we're the ad nauseum deck. And then I played it and I started tracking my results and I was at like 82 win percentage over 90 something matches. And I was like, AJ, I'm never going to lose again. You found the greatest tech of all time. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, people realized that they just needed to board in a couple sweepers against me, and I was back down to barely above where I was before. But that high and low, it hurts.
Yeah, I remember that era, and playing against the Epic Storm was like, I don't really need to stop tendrils most of the time. Like, I need electrickeries and whatever, or engineered explosives way more than I need Flusterstorm against this particular deck. And then there was sort of an evolution where like a year or two ago, probably 2 years ago at this point, what is time anymore? You and I did a co-stream together where you taught me how to play the Epic Storm. And I was surprised to learn from the driver's seat that it's not the turn 1 Black Belcher deck it used to be. It's very much a build your resources, take your time kind of situation where Electrickery doesn't do anything. Or like very little. Like, does every build even have empty in it? You probably keep 1 around, right? Or have you cut it?
It have to be Veil of Summer somehow.
Okay. All right. Yeah. All right. Thought so. But yeah, those like 3 empties main plus the 1 in the board, or even just going all 4 main and just 10 goblins bet every turn 1. That era, I recall it. I also remember in that era, Caleb Shearer on Ad Nauseam having this like 3 or 4 tendrils version where he was just like okay to set up like a tendrils you for 8, 3 turns later tendrils you for 8 kind of game plan post board against certain types of hate, and that was a pretty cool thing too when people weren't ready for it.
The old grinding station variants, they did not have the card grinding station in them. I would just like to point that out. It's just legacy players are terrible with naming decks, and that's what they wanted to call it.
Right, grinding station combo, which is a black tendrils deck that does not involve grinding station. Got it.
Oh, I love legacy.
So while we're talking about jukes here, in constructing your juke, make sure you are thinking about not your opponent's game 1 deck, but also their game 2 and game 3 deck, right? So, for example, like let's say you're playing something like Reanimator. You know your opponent's going to bring in something like a Leyline or a Grafdigger's Cage. So a normal sideboard answer to that is something like a Serenity that just destroys that stuff. Whereas your juke is, hey, I'm going to play Show and Tell and just completely ignore the axis of hate that you are bringing in. And that just allows me to cheat my creature into play. It ignores the hate cards that you are going to bring in, and I'm good to go. So sometimes it's not about making your opponent leave in the bad cards that are in their deck in game 1. It can also be invalidating their post-sideboard approach.
Yeah, the Show and Tell is a good one because that is a pretty standard thing that Reanimator does. And we're in a format of main deck Pyroblast. And boarding in blue cards in a format of main deck Pyroblast, you better do a good job selling your opponent that you're not a blue deck in game one, which Reanimator is great at doing. Really clever, like, double juke of like, here's a philosophical question. Is main deck Pyroblast a juke? Like, that's not like a normal way to build a deck, and it's like a proactive... no, it's not a juke. It's just like probably just tech. I don't know. But
how about we use the word hedging? It's like hedging
it's
against
hedge,
the
yeah.
expected metagame.
Yeah, it's a hedge, and being a non-blue deck game one and then being a blue deck game two after the Pyroblasts are gone, pretty clever. But Show and Tell does still get got by like Flusterstorm, Spell Pierce, Force of Will, the same way that the Reanimator game one plan does. So there is an axis of relevance, but you still have your discard spells as Reanimator, as long as you can ignore your graveyard spells. I would still consider that a juke.
I was talking to someone over the weekend, and they mentioned to me that the Reanimator player revealed an Underground Sea in game once they knew to keep in Pyroblast for the post-board games.
Yep.
And that's something you have to be aware of. Like, hey, you see Underground Sea out of Reanimator, you have to know that Show and Tell is coming. But I'm glad that Phil mentioned Reanimator, because I do think we were talking about Xandid Swarm earlier, and if that's a juke. Out of Reanimator, I think it's a true juke and not a sidestep. Here's why. So you might be thinking, I'm going to leave in Swords to Plowshares, it's good against Gristlebrand. That's fine. But Brian, I would bet money that you board out Prismatic Ending versus Reanimator. And that's the card that people would normally use to answer that Xandid Swarm. So now the Xandid Swarms are more effective, because if they're using Swords to Plowshares on a bug, that Archon of Cruelty or, Gristlebrand or whatever gets to stick around.
Yeah, that is a good step in the right direction. Generally, depending on how many cards I'm bringing in, I will cut Prismatic Ending first, like before anything else. That's the first card out of my deck. And then I'm probably shaving Plows too, like leaving like 2 in to dig for in case they stick an Archon or a Sarah's Emissary. Like one of the, like plowing Grizzlebrand doesn't really work. They just draw 14 in response and reanimate 2 more creatures. But all the other creatures in the deck are great targets for plow. But my primary objective is to stop those things from being in play. So I probably don't have many plows in the first place. And if you get me to 0.1 at a Xantid Swarm, then that was an effective use of your resources.
That one by you.
That's right. And the thing you said about seeing Underground Sea game once, leaving in your Pyroblast, or even bringing in more, that's just heads up legacy play. I actually have a coaching client who joined my Patreon and started getting coaching from me because I played him on camera, and he just showed me he just killed me with like Omniscience in game one. And I was like, I saw black mana, I'm going to bring in all my graveyard hate. And then I wiped him out as a Reanimator deck in game two after not seeing anything Reanimator related game one except black sources. And he was like, he messaged me and was like, I have a lot to learn and you're the one to teach me, after seeing that happen. And like that's just like part of getting your reps and really understanding the format. And another thing I want to say is every time I play against Reanimator on camera, I board out all my Prismatic Endings and I say, these don't do anything in the matchup. And then invariably, some number of people in the comments say, you can hit Animate Dead with that. And it's like, okay, let's talk about, since we're talking about like plans and sideboarding and stuff, like let's talk about what doing anything is. Like, literally, does it do anything? Yeah, I guess. Technically. Does it do anything that's going to result in a game win? No. If your Prismatic Ending, if your plan is to sorcery speed, Prismatic Ending someone's Animate Dead that has already put some creature into play that has gained some value of some kind, you're already signing up to lose, compared to a card in your sideboard like Surgical Extraction or Flusterstorm or Veil of Summer. How are you going to look me in the eye and tell me that Prismatic Ending belongs in the deck? Just have some awareness of like what cards actually do and if they do enough to deserve a spot in your deck. Because usually Magic is a complicated game and you can usually find some situation where a card does something. But we're talking about decks switching their plan completely to make your main plan already bad. Really make sure that every card in your deck is doing as much as it can be, because your opponent is trying to make them invalid already, and leaving cards with that are mostly useless in is a punt. So just don't do that.
I've played a lot of both top miracles and post-top miracles. I would board out all of my white cards. Literally all of them. Terminus swords, everything. And Brian, for the reason that you're talking about is, yes, those cards have functions, but if you let Gristlebrand or whatever resolve, there's a good chance you're getting buried anyway. And having swords in your hand doesn't really achieve what you're looking for. So I can't imagine leaving in the sorcery speed version to hit an enchantment to put that creature back in the graveyard to be reanimated is what we want to be doing here.
Right. It's 1/3 of the reanimation spells in the deck, and you have to completely dodge the draw 14 into unmask you 3 times. That's going to happen. Or the follow-up Archon that shreds your hand, or whatever the hell. Not worth the conversation.
So something that we've talked about a couple times in this episode is these blue decks being able to dig towards whatever niche answer they need, with your brainstorms, your ponders, your expressive iterations, all of that stuff. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that you have to have an answer to every single thing in your deck for every single post-sideboard game. You will often gain percentages by saying, I'm going to ignore X happening because stopping Y is so much more important.
Phil, you should tell that to my YouTube's comment section. People love building wishboards with literally answers to everything. And in Legacy, we've actually come up with a term for it, and it's like the 7% rule, where every card in your sideboard is worth roughly 7%. That's just how it works. And if it's going to be useful, you need it to be a card that you would use 7% of the time at least. So having a wish target that answers enchantments, how often are you using that? Is it 7%? If not, cut it. And that's just an easy way of looking at if your sideboard space is effective. So a lot of the time I'll look at something like MTG Goldfish, and if I see that Enchantress is 0.01% of the metagame, maybe I'll leave that Tranquility at home, for example.
Yeah, Karn the Great Creator players, I'm looking at you for this one. I have played so many donation deck lists where there are all these super niche artifact cards that I might want one in every 100 games. And will they win me that game if I am in that spot? Unquestionably. But of the cards in the wishboard, what are you actually getting? Your Liquid Metal Coating, your Mycosynth Lattice, your Ensnaring Bridge, and maybe one other target every once in a while.
Like a Tormod script for those high pressure situations, or when you need to loop an earlier thing. And since we're talking about wishboards, those aren't free. They don't just poof out of the aether. These are cards that are not in your sideboard now because they're in wishboards. Is another Flusterstorm, or Duress, or another Brazen Borrower in a Karn deck. You're gonna get more mileage out of a card like that than you are out of that niche wish target that comes up 1 in 100 games. Because Brazen Borrower, you're gonna bring that in 95 out of 100 games.
I'm not trying to make fun of the individual here, but last week I recorded Glittering Neoform in Pioneer. So I'm going to cast Glittering Wish, and it turns out that there's a green-white hybrid Lay of the Land. And you can go get a basic land out of your deck. I'm sorry, it doesn't have to be basic. It just has to be a basic land type. And they're like, yeah, this way you can guarantee your 3rd land for Eldritch Evolution. Sure, that's something you can do, but now you're playing Lay of the Land or an equivalent in your sideboard, and you're spending 2 turns to go find your 3rd mana. How often in even 1,000 games of Magic is that going to come up? And I think that it's so easy to just look at cards that are possibilities instead of being a little bit more realistic about this sideboard space.
I would add a land or 2 to my deck before I made that a thing in my sideboard. Just if hitting your 3rd land drop is a problem, solve that in your mana base, not in your wishboard. I don't know when this is going to be up, and I'm not going to step on Brian's hustle too much, but I was interviewed for an article coming up on the epicstorm.com through the Looking Glass, and it was questions about being an Uro pile versus the Epic Storm, basically. And one of the questions was, how do you prepare in your sideboard for the Epic Storm and other combo decks? And my answer was basically like, I try to bake it into my main deck with endurances and dress downs, and otherwise I don't. Like, a deck has to be worth it. The matchup has to be bad enough that your cards don't touch it on their own, and it has to be prevalent enough that it's worth that 7% of your sideboard. And like a card like Collector Roof, which gets the Epic Storm while also getting lands, death and taxes, 8-cast, etc. across the board. Heck yeah, let's do it. Am I putting Mindbreak Trap in my blue control deck? 0%. Like, that's just not going to happen. So really maximizing those sideboard spots. And we're kind of far afield. We went from jukes to transformational sideboards into how to build a sideboard, but I think we're still, I'm going to start reeling it in. If you're going to try to juke or transform, that juke or transformation needs to be worth whatever percentage you're losing by not having a sideboard. That actually just furthers your plan.
And the more slots your juke takes, the more you are taking away from the average matchup, or any matchup where you don't use the juke. So for example, if you are a blue cantrip deck, like Doomsday, and you can play 2 cards as your juke, 2 mentors, two Doomsdays, 2 some big enchantment that is going to dodge most removal spells, and you can just do that at the cost of 2 cards, that's totally fine and great. If your juke is like 8 cards, and it's 4 Leyline of the Void, 4 Helm of Obedience, that comes at a much higher cost. Would you have run the 4 Leylines anyway? Yeah, sure. Would you have run 4 Helms without wanting to do the juke? No.
I would actually like to say I think 8 is relatively small. And I know that may not be a popular opinion, but when you look at a lot of jukes, people board 13 cards sometimes and then leave like 2 flex answers. They're like, oh, I'll run 2 Brazen Borrowers in those slots to be like, if I have to force through my main plan, that will be the sideboard plan. Otherwise, I'll board these other 13. So when you look at a deck like Black Red Reanimator, for example, they often bring in 4, 6 answers to things like Leyline of the Void or other various graveyard hate, where if they board into something like the Witherbloom combo, it's 8 cards. In my opinion, it's pretty compact, and a lot of people board out things like Lightning Bolt against Reanimator because it doesn't really achieve anything meaningful unless it's exactly killing the opponent. So a lot of that small ball removal exits their deck, it dodges graveyard hate. It is 8 cards, but I do think that the Witherbloom combo it's one of my favorite jukes in all of Legacy. I feel like it's small and compact, and I love it.
Yeah, and there is also overlap to jukes if your main deck can tutor. Like that Storm deck with the Leyline Helm that got me, they might only have 1 Helm, and they're playing 4 Leylines for the decks that are faster than them anyway, and they're an Infernal Tutor Lion's Eye Diamond deck. They might just have the 1 Helm in there, and they just happen to rip it in my game. It doesn't have to be an 8-card juke if you can go look for it.
It's worth noting, it might be their answer to Veil of Summer.
Yeah, sure. It's just cool in general. It slowed down my graveyard stuff and then randomly killed me in a spot where I didn't think I could die.
All right, folks, do we have anything else we want to say about transformational sideboards, sideboard jukes, sideboarding, our love letters to Karn the Great Creator, or anything like that?
Sorry, I just puked in my mouth a little bit, Phil. Sorry, didn't mean to.
I would like to repeat a point that Sam Black made in an article back in the ancient times. I think it was like the 1800s when I read this, but it still is something I think about. And he wrote in the article that when you're presenting a deck in game 2 and game 3, you're presenting a deck. Like you are building a deck out of a pool of 75 cards available to you to play Magic with the best 60 of those. And his point was, you wouldn't submit a 60 card deck in game 1. Like if you were just building a deck with no sideboard for casual play or whatever, you wouldn't play like 3 Ponder, 3 Swords to Plowshares, 3 this, 3 that. You would probably have 4 of all your best cards. And thinking about your plan and your sideboard map versus just like doing the skim thing. Like I'm bringing in 4 cards and I'll just take out 1 of each of these. Like you should really figure out what your sideboard needs to be pointed at and what your deck needs to do. If Ponder is going to help you find your sideboard cards, don't cut a Ponder. If Ponder is going to get red blasted and not going to be fast enough, cut all your Ponders. Like sort of present a deck, think about it as a deck, not like some weird reactive thing that you're doing on the back foot against what your opponent's doing.
I would say skimmer for a long time, and one of my big level ups was just realizing that you don't have to do that, and you can just board out entire sections of your deck, or entire cards, like just board out all of them. And it took me a long time to get there. Like, information today travels so much faster, but I had already been playing Magic for like 10 years before that clicked in my head. So
Yeah,
take the
we
advice.
were all skimmers. That's why this article stuck with me, because I was definitely in that, like, I had already emerged from the kitchen table to the LGS, and I was then stepping from the LGS into regional events. And when I read this, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm a big bad skimmer. And lately, a lot of people have been asking me about Shark still, because I've been playing it at a lot of events, and they're like, hey, are you going to write a sideboard guide for this? And here's a free one for the people who are not in my Patreon. Here's the sideboard guide. Every matchup is a plow matchup or a force matchup, and you cut the one that's bad. It's that easy. Is Force of Will good in the deck, or is Swords of Pleasure good in the deck? Because rarely are both good. And there's 4 cards you could cut right away. 8 or more if you also cut the endings. And there's your sideboard map.
While we're still on the subject of jukes, one thing that happens a lot at local game stores is players will sideboard, and while they're boarding, they'll go, okay, I want to bring in these cards, and they'll lay them down in front of them. Don't let your opponent know how many cards you're bringing in. If you're bringing in 10 cards, I know you're juking. So if you're going to be playing a deck that does this, do the old shuffle 15 in, shuffle 15 out. Even if you're not going to sideboard, don't give your opponent the information. Try to be as anonymous as possible.
With the caveat here, don't fuck around with shuffling all 15 cards unless you know what your plan is and what you're taking out already, because you might leave in or take out an important piece. I have absolutely seen people go for the 15 card, shuffle it all in, make a big show of it, and then like cast an Infernal Tutor and go like, oh shit, I boarded that out on accident.
I heard about some dummy who forgot to take his Peer into the Abyss out of his deck for game 3 and then accidentally cast it turn 1 in sanctioned play when it was supposed to be in the sideboard. Isn't that crazy?
I wonder who that was.
Yeah, what sicko would get away with that? But yeah, protecting information is good too. Like tournament mannerisms and stuff. I feel like we've covered a lot of that, and maybe it's another episode someday. But yeah, if somebody just lays down 4 cards, I will probably be predicting like what 4 cards do I think Red Prison is going to bring in against my Uro deck. It's probably like some number of Red Blast and Unlicensed Hearse, and I will react to the fact that you're doing that. Just hide that information. And if you're not going to sideboard, pretend you're going to sideboard. If I do ever split, like board out 2 of the plows or whatever, I will sideboard out 1 of the plows for 1 of the plows going from game 2 into game 3, and just like I'll do it face up on the table, like not cards face up, but like make it clear that a card has left my deck and another card has come in. Just it's free. Move stuff around. Don't give your opponent the knowledge that they're playing it's the same 60 cards again.
So one other thing on sideboarding here, like going back to the Sam Black idea and like presenting a cohesive deck for game 2 and game 3. If you write a sideboard plan, you will probably figure out what matchups you do not have a cohesive plan for. So for example, I recently played a very questionable mono red sneak attack deck that had some extra spice in it. And the deck did not have enough sideboard cards in it for rounds where you needed it to board out both Chalice of the Void and Trinisphere for one reason or another. And so I went, okay, this is going to sound crazy, but to fill my slots here, I have to play a Leyline of the Void in this random matchup that does nothing to do with the graveyard, so that I just have 1 more colored card I can imprint on a Chrome Mox. Because, like, that was the point that I was at. My sideboard plan for the matchup was just so bad.
Yeah, this is extremely prevalent in Vintage, where main decks contain, like, Flusterstorm and Pyroblast in large numbers, and sometimes you play against Shops, which has no spells and no blue spells, like no non-creature spells, no non-permanent spells, and you have to get your 6 Pyroblast and Flusterstorms out of your deck, period, because they're blank-ass cardboard. So you need at least 6 cards for Shops. And then Dredge usually follows similar rules. Like there's cards that are stone dead against Dredge, but you need them in the main deck for the blue mirrors, and you need enough cards to get them out and real cards in, which in a lot of ways, Vintage, even though it's like the biggest and most complicated format, has the cleanest, most easy sideboards because it's very clear. There are 7 cards for Dredge, 7 cards for Shops, and 1 flex slot for Blue Mirrors. And there are 7 cards in my deck that need to leave the deck when I'm playing against non-Blue Mirrors.
Brian, I'm glad you mentioned the 1 flex spot for blue decks. I was actually going to do that because every blue deck that I've ever played has 1 Hurkyl's Recall, and you're like, oh, I just have to get that out of my deck. I need to board in another Fluster or whatever. But the last time I played Vintage, I was like, oh, actually, am I supposed to leave this in? They're in Urza Saga deck. And now I'm not even sure if you need the sideboard slot where you board out the Hurkyls. Like, maybe you just leave that in moving forward, and now you gain an extra sideboard slot for Shops.
Yeah, I mean, Hurks is one of those cards that even fair decks have Urza Saga, and if your deck does anything with Moxen, Hurkyl's Recall can be a Dark Ritual. You just float 4 Hurks for 2, replay your 4 Moxen, now you have 6. Like, there's cards like Hurks that do more work, but like a Flusterstorm against Shops, that's what I'm talking about. All right, folks.
So I believe that Phil wanted to talk about Guacamole Goblin.
Oh, that's what we're doing, huh? All right. So it's time for Unfinity. So in case you haven't seen these cards floating around, Unfinity is the next air quotes silver bordered set. The next like fake Magic set with fun gimmicks that is very much meant to be a play experience rather than creating tournament legal cards. But it's different this time around because the previous silver border is now gone. These cards are black bordered, and a portion of them are now tournament legal. The ones that have sort of the holographic acorn at the bottom are fake Magic cards that you can't play in things like Legacy tournaments, and the ones that have the regular foil holographic thing at the bottom are indeed Legacy legal.
Or if they have nothing, only the rares have the oval holo stamp. A common or uncommon without an acorn is legal. The acorn being illegal is the only like for sure statement.
I have a question for the 2 judges here. Let's say that they've spoiled a Stormcrow token in this set, and hypothetically, they make Crowstorm a Legacy legal card. Am I allowed to play my silver bordered Crowstorm?
Yes, this is already established with Steam Flogger Boss. Or I guess they just printed Steam Flogger Boss as a black border card in the otherwise silver border set. So maybe it's not established. But if a version of a card is legal, you can play any version. That's just Magic rules.
Okay. I was
also,
just curious.
Bryant, we've talked about this off camera several times. You're not getting Crowstorm. They already spoiled the card. It's an acorn, and it's not Crowstorm.
Oh, I didn't. Well,
the whole set is spoiled. It has been for a week.
I was face full of muscles when you told me this. I wasn't listening.
Look, it is literally impossible to keep up with all of the Magic spoilers now. Like, there has been this just, like, absolutely crazy run of, like, Unfinity, the EDH 40k Warhammer decks, and now the Magic 30 stuff is starting, the Brothers War is starting. It is a blur.
Agreed. It is preposterous, and Brothers War, we got, like, 5 or 6 cards of that, and then surprise, there's also Transformer cards in the Brothers War, and then surprise also, here is a year's worth of promos that includes $1,000 4 packs of fake proxy beta. It's been a busy time for people to keep up with Magic products, but we're not talking about any of that today. We are talking about Unfinity. Let's get into the cards. We've identified 4 cards that could see eternal play that are legal. And before we get into this, Rebel, the member of the Commander Advisor group, who is awesome and worth a follow on Twitter at SunRebel, SON Rebel, she cracked a box of Unfinity and put the legal cards in a stack and the acorn cards in a stack. And it looks like about 2/3 of the box is legal. Like the ratio is skewed towards tournament legality. That said, not many of them pass the bar of playability, and we've identified 4 of those that we think are worth at least mentioning. The first one is Embiggen. It's 1 mana, green instant. Until end of turn, target non-Brushwag creature gets +1/+1 for each super type, card type, and subtype it has. So non-Brushwag is a funny way to say this can't target changelings, because changelings would have just gotten +500 or whatever. But this does do big things embigged things on certain creatures, most notably infect creatures. Inkmoth Nexus is a artifact creature land Phyrexian Inkmoth. So this is just like +5/+5 for 1. Did I count that correctly?
Yes, and for the other creatures in the deck, it's +4/+4.
Right, because they all have 2 creature types and card types. And it's like kind of another Berserk that doesn't take any setup. I don't know if this is what Infect needs. There's enough like hexproof spells like Vines of Vastwood and the +2/+2 and hexproof version. Like
Blossoming Calm.
Yeah, Blossoming Calm. Or Blossoming Calm's a white card, isn't it? Isn't that the white card with rebound?
Isn't that the green one?
It is Blossoming something. Blossoming Defense.
Oh shit. Yeah, Blossoming Calm is the white one.
Oh
Yeah,
no.
Checkmate, nerds. I didn't know the
Yeah,
name at all.
Blossoming Defense.
Yeah, Blossoming
That was
Defense.
close.
Okay. Yeah, like I feel like Infect is less about size. Like there's tons of size already in the pump spells that exist, and it's now about protecting the creatures more. But in Big and Undeniable, this is most of a Become Immense without using your graveyard or requiring any setup. This would probably at least replace Become Immense, but it's not doing anything that Infect doesn't already have access to.
Yeah, this is a great case of the power level being there, but Infect itself maybe not being a premier strategy. Like small creature, like inexpensive creatures became a lot less good once the control decks had access to Swords to Plowshares and Prismatic Endings in Game 1.
Could be a nice budget option for what it's worth. I mean, I haven't checked on Berserk in a while, but last time I knew they were still a little over 100. Perhaps, you just pull one out of your pack. You can run that until you get the full thing.
I think Berserk got a few reprints. The cheapest version appears to be $18 from a secret lair drop. And there's a conspiracy version for $30 from the vault's $40. And then you get up into like the Alpha Beta Unlimited ones that are hundreds. Yeah, Berserk's pretty affordable, but this card will be cheaper. It's a common from a set that is likely to be widely opened, and nobody's going to want the cards once they're open.
I'll be honest. Last time I looked at a 1 green instant, it was Veil of Summer, so my apologies.
Yep, only have eyes for one. Let's go next into Blank Goblin. This is the one that I think has the most buzz around it, and people will be most likely to try. The blank is where you put a sticker, and one of the possible stickers you could put on is Mind Goblin, which makes for a funny internet joke. So I'm just going to call this Mind Goblin in conversation forever.
I think that's where the community is at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where R&D was at when they put Mind in the sticker pool. They knew. Okay, so Mind Goblin, 2 and a red, 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, put a sticker on it, and then you get 1 red mana for each unique vowel in the name of this card. So the way stickers work is you need to bring a deck with at least 10 sticker sheets in it, 10 unique sticker sheets. And at the start of the game, you shuffle them up and get 3. And those are your sticker sheets for the game. And then if anything says put a sticker on, you pull it off your available sticker sheet for this game. The community has done the math. Peter Vanderham made a whole chart about it. Mind Goblin, if you build your sticker deck correctly, is guaranteed to at least net 1 mana. You'll get 4 mana out of your 3 investment. 70% of the time you get 5 mana, and like 20 or 30% of the time you get 6. So this is a ritual. Bryant, you're the expert here. What are we going to do? Is the community interested in a 2 and a red, 2/2 that makes at least 1 mana when you cast it?
For Legacy, there's been some chatter about whether or not this is good enough for goblins, because theoretically it allows you to just turbo into Muxus very, very easily. There's been some talk about like, well, do you play Ironcrag Feet, whatever. I don't think that's really viable in goblins, and we haven't seen it for a reason. So this being on tribal theme makes it a little bit more interesting. You might want to ask someone like Eli Goings if it's actually good enough. I'd be surprised if it was, but it's something at least fun to try for a stream or a video or whatever. Where I've heard more chatter is in Pauper, because this thing is Seething Song on average. 70% of the time it's at least Seething Song. But it's Seething Song that leaves a body behind for, what is it called? The 1 black and a colorless and a black.
The Week?
No.
Nope.
Deadly Dispute. There we go. So it leaves a body behind for Deadly Dispute. And that is interesting to me, but I don't know if it's still worth running Seething Song. Like right now, the Pauper combo decks don't play Seething Song. So does the body push it over the edge? I'll find out in a couple weeks.
Right. And The one big thing I saw was like Cloudstone Curio with Grinning Ignis in this, which like does make infinite mana and Storm. Also, that seems like more of an EDH thing than getting 3 fragile pieces together that each cost 3 onto a legacy board. I do think this card is more applicable in stompy decks, like Goblins. Not really a stompy deck, but you said it. It's a deck that would benefit from a burst of mana and also has other synergies with this thing being a Goblin. I don't know if Red Prison wants this, probably not. But they are also kind of a Goblin deck that wants mana sometimes. I don't know. I don't really see this spawning a new combo archetype or slotting into existing ones, but maybe like mono red sneak attack. This would be a sweet one to sneak attack in. That gets you a lot of mana if you're already sneaking around. But at that point, why don't you put in your Emrakul? I could see this on the fringe. Anything that makes more mana than it costs is worth a talk in Eternal formats, but I don't really see it breaking anything, except maybe Magic Online, if they can even code for this.
All right, a quick note on goblins. I had a discussion with someone the other day that basically said, yeah, when we were tracking our data, the Muxus wins actually accounted for the lowest percentage of the wins versus just like getting in the red zone and beating, or like executing some sort of sacrifice-based board state that actually killed the opponent. So while I conceptually really love the idea of like Turbo Muxus, and like that scratches a certain itch for me, it turns out data-wise that like the Muxus kills weren't happening as often as people might expect they were.
Right. And I played Goblins recently, and Eli was really generous sharing information with me from behind his Patreon walls. And one of them is you sideboard into so many non-Goblins these days that Muxus and Ringleader start getting cut post-board. That's like not even the plan because they're not reliable. And I thought that was really interesting. I would not have figured that out myself.
One thing I would like to know is sometimes we, not even legacy players, just deck builders, players, whatever, new cards come out, and the easiest way to think about a new card is, what does this go into? Instead of thinking, what can I change about my deck to maximize the potential of this card? And I'm not saying that Turbo Muxus is the bee's knees or anything, but what if, you know, the 4 Mind Goblin, Guacamole Goblin into 4 Muxus build actually is decent, but no one's testing it because we've all decided that the Muxus win percentage is too low. So, I mean, I had this issue when Wishclaw Talisman came out. I was like, I don't know, 3 mana tutor, I could just play Grim Tutor and not give my opponent a tutor. And I didn't click for another month and a half in my head that I could just fundamentally change the deck. So I just want to make note that perhaps there's something there.
I have complete confidence in the Goblin community that they will try everything. They usually do. That is a busy community, not afraid to try crazy stuff. All right, this thing is breaking an hour already. Let's get through these last 2 cards real quick. Clown Car is the next one.
Phil Blackman's vehicle?
Yes. What it do?
What it do, baby? Yeah, you already know.
Okay. Clown Car is an X mana 1/1. Just colorless X, a single X. When Clown Car enters the battlefield, roll X 6-sided dice. For each odd result, create a 1/1 Clown Robot Artifact Creature token. For each even result, put a +1 counter on Clown Car. And it has Crew 2. It is a vehicle, if I didn't say that. On average, you will get a +1 counter on your thing and a creature that can crew it for every 2x is. This is in that like Walking Ballista kind of space. It's really good with Affinity because Walking Ballista, no matter how much you put into it, still only makes 1 artifact, but you could like X equals 3 this thing, end up with 2 or 3 artifacts for Thoughtcast and Thought Monitors on a subsequent turn. This is worse than Walking Ballista if you have infinite mana, because Ballista just kills your opponent. If you are locked under a Null Rat effect, this one's much better, because you get to go wide with a bunch of little dinguses, and just ignore the vehicle, it can't be crewed, but attack with the creatures. This one's kind of interesting, and we'll probably see it kicking around. The thing that I saw most discussed about this is, if I have infinite mana, how are we going to resolve this? And I think the answer is like pretty obviously just take out your phone. There's random number generation apps or like coin flip apps. Just type 1 billion into your coin flip app and see how many of each thing you get. That's not really controversial. I think that's pretty easy.
I even use those for CDH. Like you play webcam, you have 15 cards in hand, you cast Gamble. Random number generator, baby. Easiest thing you can do.
Yep, absolutely. We have the technology. Phil, you're our robot homie. Do you want to say anything I didn't say about this card?
Yeah, don't view this as a card in a combo deck. View this as a mana outlet in your deck that has lands that can produce 2 or 3 mana at the same time. Especially if you care about the number of artifacts in play, say for like a Nettle Cyst type card, a Cranial Plating type card, this can be relatively appealing.
Okay, last card. And I know Bryant has thoughts about this one. This is Pair o' Dice Lost. The pun being it is a pair of dice. 3 green instant, so 5 mana instant. Roll 2 6-sided dice. Return any number of cards with total mana value X or less from your graveyard to your hand, where X is the total of those results. Exile Paradise Lost. So, bottom basement, you get back any number of cards that have total mana value 2, which is like all your Lotus Petals, all your LEDs, and Infernal Tutor. And top end, 12 mana. A deck built for that could probably just pick its whole graveyard up. Bryant, what do we think?
The Storm Discord has been brewing a lot with this card, mostly in Ant. There have been some dedicated Pair o' Dice Lost decks as well, but a lot of people are looking at this as a possible Past in Flames replacement, so that way you can go pure bug, and that way you get a better mana base out of the Ant deck. You can play an extra basic or two, you don't have to play the couple of red sources, which is nice, but then there's a lot of people that are looking at it as an ad nauseum alternative, which is really tough, because if you're cutting ad nauseum, you now have 2 engines in your deck that are both graveyard dependent, which is already a weakness of the deck. So you're either cutting ad nauseum or you're replacing Past in Flames. And if you're replacing Past in Flames, you don't get that extra kickback. So you don't get the flash it back. That said, Force of Negation sort of changed the game there. What are you actually losing? I guess one nice aspect is we're in an era where Hydroblast has been picking up. Pair o' Dice Lost has nothing to blast it with, which is kind of cute. I have been seeing that come up as a talking point. So it's interesting. I'm probably going to try to record a dedicated Pair o' Dice Lost video. But will it see play? I remain skeptical in the long term.
If someone breaks it, my guess is that it's Jax.
Yeah, whatever Jax is doing, just watch that Twitter feed. Phil, changing directions to more of your wheelhouse and I guess mine, but I associate you with this sort of nonsense. How about like Cheerios or some nonsense where this is like the top end rather than a dedicated Storm deck? Like this is something you can Glimpse of Nature into if you have like mana floating and need to gas up the tank. This seems like kind of more a place we would see something like that. Not that those decks are great, but you know.
The short version here is that in order to make that work, you need Gaia's Cradle in your Cheerios type deck, and you also need to have a bunch of artifacts in play already. And if you have the big mana and you have the 0 drops in play already, like you're probably already doing fine. So that feels like win more or clunky to me, because I have trouble casting 2 mana cards in those sorts of decks a lot of times, just because like the mana doesn't work out super well after you like commit to an initial glimpse or 2.
Yeah,
so
those decks are for sure suspicious in their execution, and you'd probably need a sack outlet like a Phyrexian or Ashnod's Altar to turn your Mem Knights into 2 mana, and then that mana casts Paradise Lost and gets back all your Mem Knights. And yeah, it sounds like a mess, but you know someone's going to send it into one of us.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll look forward to playing it. It will be very fun. Those decks are always fun. They're always bad, but always fun.
I was a part of an interesting conversation over the weekend about how a lot of these cards built for fun formats. So on whatever limited CDH, EDH, whatever, and how they impact Legacy, because all these cards are added to the Legacy card pool. For better or for worse, I don't have strong opinions, but the idea that a lot of these cards are now random. So we're looking at Maddening Hex, Paradise Lost, and how we're adding dice rolling into competitive nature of Magic, which it's always sort of been there, but you have to look at people potentially not being honest with their dice rolls. Maybe not getting a full die roll in on their Maddening Hex, just dropping it on the table, Paradise Lost. Maybe they really need to return 6 and you have to watch them, that sort of thing. So I do think that sometimes the random nature needs to be enforced. I just want to make note of that, I guess.
Yeah, keep your opponents honest. make it clear, or like let your opponent roll for your maddening hex or whatever. Like if it's their card, you roll, or I don't know. I guess you could cheat too, but you probably didn't practice cheating at home the way. I don't know. These sort of things always. If you hold the die up high enough and shake it a couple times in a close hand, it's going to be random unless it's literally like a weighted die. So just keep your opponent honest about that. Let's wrap this up. I think we said everything we need to say about Unfinity. It's been on our auxiliary topic if we need it for the last 3 weeks, and we finally did it. And the sky is not falling. Magic is fine. It's going to be cool. You probably won't see these cards, and it won't ruin anything if you do.